Okay, so let's talk about the weekly review and do like a quick overview of how I do it. And then if you have any questions, feel free to email me and I can share more. But at the high level, there's two parts to it. There's reflection and there's systems maintenance. And if you like the Venn diagrams, the meta productivity framework, then reflection is the philosophy side and systems maintenance is more on the hustle side. But I just want to say right off the bat, I'm biased towards reflection. I think if you're doing this on a weekly basis, you're far better off than if you're trying to do systems maintenance. Reflection will get you realigned with what matters to you. Then you can tolerate actually a decent amount of chaos in your systems and still be very effective in the direction you want to head in. So that's why I like to prioritize this. And you're already quite familiar with what we do here. So, there's a minimal weekly review, which at the very least, I'll do one of these every week. And this is like the minimum. Like, you can always do one of these. But then if you have more time, there's a couple more advanced things you can do. So something that I do, and this is quite extensive for a lot of people, but I found that it changed my life, is what I call the narrative weekly review, which is very similar to the 4 R's monthly review, but at a weekly level and a little more granularity about each day. So basically, you bring up the week using memory aids. I journal a lot, so I'll review my journals, or I'll look at, I have this whiteboard in front of me. I'll look at what happened that week. And then every single day I account for the day, like with a couple bullet points. I might say like a one-liner, maybe it's a big day, maybe it was a bad day, maybe it was a good day. I'll often write down social events so that by the end of this, I have 7 days of high-level bullet point journal entries on what my week looked like. And this was, when I started doing this, it was so profound because I realized my memory wasn't good enough to remember some of these really important details of like things that happened on Tuesday that are impacting me on Saturday, etc. And so it's quite involved, but I see the value of it. So I do this almost every week now. And then once you've pulled it up to mind, which by the way, this whole process takes me 15 minutes. The first time you do it, you'll go into the weeds a lot, especially if you have journal entries, you'll like start reading everything. But now I just do it in 15 minutes. And then once I've pulled everything up to mind, I will write down my insights, and I have these 3 questions. I'll say what were my wins for the week, what were my mistakes, my L's and my W's, and then the most important, which is what advice would I give myself for the coming week? And usually there's something really clear. This is actually a real one from a couple of years ago, where I realized that even a little bit of alcohol on like a Tuesday had implications like throughout the rest of the week, even if I didn't drink again. So yeah, I'll give myself some advice. So that's the narrative weekly review, and if you're interested in that, there's a great article that I wrote on my Substack, which you may have seen, called We All Have Amnesia, where I make the case for it and I go into more detail on how to do it. Another option, I don't know if we've talked about this, but is an areas audit. And some of my clients really like this one, where basically, if you have well-defined areas in your GTD system, if you're happy with the way that they're labeled, and this would probably not include like the specific work areas, it depends. It's more like high level, like looking at the empire of your life. You can go through each of these areas. Like these are some of mine from before. These are kind of standard ones that most people have. And then just give yourself a rating out of 5 and just like a quick snapshot. And usually you will identify if one of them is going really well. So you kind of give yourself credit for that. And then one of them that's being neglected. And you'll notice across time, in order to do like well in career and education, for instance, you have to sacrifice fun and recreation or something like that. You'll notice the trade-offs that you're making passively. And this audit will give you a chance to course correct if those trade-offs are not conscious, if they're not good for you. So that's another one. That's reflection. Okay. This is the most important part for me. This is something that you can do literally within 2 to 5 minutes if you do the minimal stuff. And then even the more involved stuff, you can eventually get to a level where you do 15 minutes. But none of this will help you clean up your systems, which we'll talk about next. Systems maintenance is where people tend to get bogged down. But at a very simple, to put it very simply, it's really just clearing up your digital workspaces and then updating your GTD system to reflect your new priorities. So you process your tasks like you normally would, like you would on a daily basis using the daily checklist. And then you specifically think about your week and you're like, okay, what are my priorities this week? What am I going to do this coming week? So I've put this into a checklist. I took some stuff from Tiago Forte as well, and then I combined it with some of the stuff that I've learned. So some of his writing on this, if you want to go really deep, it's very, very good. But basically you have this whole section up here, which is all clearing your digital workspace stuff. It's processing a bunch of different inboxes, like all of these are inboxes as far as I'm concerned. Your browser tabs, your email, your files, your notes. And then at the end, You want to have your GTD system reflect the updated reality with the updated intentions that you've collected from these steps, so that your future self this week has something to look to know his priorities. And I like to start here. So, if you don't have time to watch this whole video, this is the most important part in the systems maintenance section. In fact, if you do reflection, you can jump straight to this and you don't even have to do any of this stuff, in my opinion. And basically, and I'll show you what this looks like in a sec, there are three mechanics for your tasks. You got to indicate your deadlines. You got to move intended to-dos to the today bucket, which I use as the week view, which is a bit confusing. And then label what you really want to do as high priority. So you got those three basic moves once you're in your GTD system. So let's look at that. Let's look at what that looks like. I hope the recording is continuing. So at the end of the week, you're going to have a bunch of stuff in your inbox. And also, you've just done your reflection, and maybe you did an areas audit or something like that, and you notice that maybe I'm not attending to my personal finances enough this week. So some of your areas are a little more salient to you, and maybe some of your projects are a little more salient to you as well. What you want to do with the mixture of all these things, like the things that have become salient and then the stuff in your inbox, is do those three basic moves. Either add a deadline to things that require a deadline. I don't know if there's anything here that requires a deadline, but let's say this is just an idea, but this is a Dubai corporation thing, required a deadline. I would just add one. I would say, okay, I have to do this by the end of the month. Or if it's just something I intend to do this week, I will drag it over to today, and that becomes my week bucket. And then if it's something that I really, really want to do this week, but doesn't have a deadline, like I personally feel like I would be compromising my standards, I will add a label. I will add high as a label. So you go through these things, you clear your inbox, and then let's say you identified your finances category as requiring more attention. You click into this and do exactly the same three steps for the tasks in there. And then what you'll end up with is a today bucket with a bunch of tasks that are organized by your projects in your areas. And if I can resize the window, you'll also see they'll have a deadline if needed, or they will have a label for high. And the benefit of the label is that now I can just filter by high, and then I can start with these tasks. I can prioritize these things first before I move to the next ones. And what will happen is some of your tasks will churn over week to week, but the ones that were labeled high, as much as possible, you don't want them to churn over. And of course, the ones with deadlines, you definitely don't want them to churn, because we use deadlines very, very sparingly. So that's the final stage of the systems maintenance part. That's the most important stuff. That's the tasks. And again, there are these three steps: indicate deadlines, move intended to do to the today bucket, and then label priority things you want to do that week with high. You'll learn a lot about yourself this week. You'll learn how many tasks you can actually do. For me, it's actually about 15 to 20, which was lower than I thought, but that's because every day I'm also generating a bunch of new tasks that I'm doing with a smaller half-life. So these tasks are kind of special because they're coming from the strategic mind of your weekly view, which only really gets unlocked when you do some kind of reflection. So to recap, you do some reflection, you identify what matters to you that week, you reorient with your values, and then you have your GTD system reflect that using these basic moves. Now, all of these steps, you can spend a lot of time into how to do these properly. I'm just going to give you a quick overview on how to do them, and you'll get the idea. But basically, if you want to do the full thing, which I don't do the full thing every week, I kind of do it as needed, which sometimes turns into like once every 10 days or something like that. I also generally keep a very clear digital environment, so I don't really need to do it every week. But basically, you got to go through each of these inboxes and some flowcharts. You got to go through each of these inboxes and decide what you're doing with these open loops. So for the browser tabs, you either close them, you either create a task out of them, and then they end up in the GTD step that we just talked about. You put them in your personal knowledge management system for later, which is its own discussion, but it's basically para. And then a bunch of tabs are really just watch later, listen later, read later. And then some stuff will be files, and they'll end up in your downloads folder or on your desktop. Email, we've talked about before, same kind of thing. You process your email. There's a great article by Tiago on this. Again, the most important thing is like stuff that ends up on your calendar and stuff that ends up in your to-do list. And then calendar generates tasks like it normally does in the standard GTD protocol. And then I'll just say a couple words about desktop downloads and notes. It's the same pattern for both, but eventually at the end of the week, you'll have like a bunch of stuff end up in your Finder in your desktop or your Windows downloads. And basically like this is a receipt for the internet bill. These things need to go somewhere. In this case, I have a folder in Para for finances. So I think the screen share might mess this up a bit, but I would put it in my finances area, which I won't organize now, but you get the idea. And the same thing applies to your notes for Evernote. Quickly show you what this looks like. So I have an inbox for Evernote. I have a bunch of things I've collected from throughout the week. And then I basically go through these things one by one, and I'll organize them into corresponding para projects or areas. And of course, Evernote is freezing on me right now, but I think you know how to do this. Okay, so it's coming up. So very similar, right? Because my projects are represented in my PKM roughly. Like sometimes there's discrepancies here versus things, but I'll throw them to their corresponding folders. I'll delete a lot of stuff, and then I'll generate tasks if anything really needs to be done that week, so that when I get to the task step, I have everything I need to plan my week. One other note on notes is that often when you capture things into notes, you don't have the most searchable title. This one's fine actually. TikTok for podcasters, that's great. But I'll have like untitled quick notes. I'll have like random forwarded emails and stuff. So I'll often take an extra step to make sure they're labeled properly so that I can find them at the end. I can do a Control F and find my notes easily. Okay, so quick recap. Systems maintenance is just about clearing your digital workspaces, updating your available tasks, and deciding on your priorities for the week. Doing that is the most important part of it. So I recommend you prioritize this if you don't have time to do everything else. But in a perfect world, we would also clear all our tabs, all our email, reference our calendar, and generate tasks and intentions as we go through this cleanup process. And then that ends up in our GTD inbox so that we really have a perfect picture of our week before we start making the priorities. An important point, you really don't need a perfect picture of your week. You're much more intuitive and decisive than the purely systems approach implies. And this is kind of my personal take, and some people get mad about this, but I really don't think like everyone needs to be like robotically going through all their systems on a weekly basis. And if you like that stuff, go for it, but not everyone has the time or the interest. And then again, this is really the most important thing. Basically, if you take one thing away from this video, the weekly review is an opportunity for once a week for you to reorient towards your values, reprioritize the things that matter to you, because the rest of your week, other people's priorities are going to start competing with that. So you really need this part. This part's not optional. You need some form of coming back to the meditation breath, so to speak. And that's why I prioritize reflection. So hopefully that helps. And let me know if you have any questions.